I built this giant mini terrain map of Middle-earth, and you might have seen it on TikTok or Instagram. But today, you're about to experience Middle-earth and the Lord of the Rings trilogy in a way that you never have before. Because today, we're going to track the paths of every character in the Lord of the Rings from start to finish as laid out in the films, as well as explore what happened to the members of the Fellowship and where they went after the events in The Return of the King. And I promise you that after this video is over, you'll never watch these movies in the same way, for the better. So before we begin, there's a few things that I want to point out about this map. Before we follow the path of some of our favorite characters from the films and literature, this map has 3D printed landmarks on it to indicate key features or places from the books and the films. And you can see I have a small Tower of Orthanc here to represent Isengard. We have Helm's Deep, the lonely mountain with Smaug, and the gates of Erebor. These landmarks are tiny, small enough to comfortably fit on a penny, but even being this small, the landmarks are simply markers. They aren't to scale. They're actually way too big. Though I did do my best to make this map as accurate as I possibly could, and it's kind of difficult to make an exact map true to Tolkien's mind, because in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Peter Jackson and his team made some changes to the terrain and distances traveled by the Fellowship to make things make more sense in a chronological order that would fit well on cinema. So to make my map fit what we saw in the movies, I did make some small artistic changes for myself, because ultimately I made this for me and I wanted to share it with you. Now, in order for us to have a true frame of reference, let's put together a small scale here. This is the Shire. A Google search reveals that it's about 120 miles east to west and 150 miles north to south. Mordor is about 850 miles away from the Shire. Now, to put that into perspective in terms of distances, which is going to be useful because this is a video about how far the Fellowship members travel, we can use this map radius calculator to show what that distance looks like. We'll choose Salt Lake City, Utah as our starting point, because that's close to where I live. And if you head out in any direction, traveling 850 miles, if you travel south, this would put you close to Chihuahua, Mexico, which happens to be where my mom was born and raised. Going north, this almost gets you to Edmonton, Canada, and just past Vancouver. And if you travel west, you'll wind up in the Pacific Ocean, and if you go east, you'll go all the way to Topeka, Kansas from Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, all of this might not mean anything for our UK viewers talking about miles and distances in the United States, so we'll put this into kilometers on a map of the UK, starting with London as our center point. 850 miles is about 1,366 kilometers, like traveling on foot from London to Rome, which is roughly the distance that Sam and Frodo traveled from the Shire to Mount Doom to destroy the ring. Now, that's all we will do about exact measurements. We're not going to get too nitpicky about scale and distance on this map in particular, but I did want to share this because it's really interesting to put into real world perspective how far these characters actually travel. So that's our frame of reference for how large this map of Middle-earth actually would be. So let's get started. So the Fellowship of the Ring begins in the Shire, and I actually have Bilbo's hobbit hole shown here to mark Hobbiton. And it's here that Gandalf and Frodo both realize that Bilbo has been in possession of the One Ring all along from the very beginning. Now Gandalf understands the danger that this implies, so he sends Frodo with Sam east to the village of Bree. Merry and Pippin, of course, join them, and the four hobbits evade the Nazgul and travel past the borders of the Shire at Buckleberry Ferry and into the village of Bree, where they meet Strider. Now, while all of this is happening, Gandalf has traveled on horseback to seek counsel from Saruman at Orthanc, and this is a considerable distance. Based on this map, we're looking at around 120 to 175 miles, and it's here that Saruman betrays Gandalf, trapping him at the top of Orthanc, which is why he misses his meeting with the hobbits at the Prancing Pony Inn. Now, it's not shown in the films until the Two Towers, but we're going to take a break from chronological order of the films to point out that it's around this time that Faramir and Boromir have taken back Osgiliath, and Lord Denethor sends Boromir west to represent Gondor at the Council of Elrond. We see this in a flashback in the Two Towers. But in the Fellowship of the Ring, the only perspective that we have is that of the hobbits who are working their way to Rivendell. And their lives are still innocent. They don't understand the gravity of what's happening and what they're being kind of caught up in. But Boromir, who's out east, knows deeply what the stakes are. He's just fought a massive battle at the final stronghold between Mordor and Minas Tirith. Keep that in mind for later. So meanwhile, we have Strider, who leads the hobbits away from Bree and off to Weathertop, where Frodo is stabbed by the Witch King. Strider then takes the hobbits into the Trollshaws, the location from The Hobbit where Bilbo and Gandalf turned these trolls into stone, and it's here where Strider hunts for the Athelas plant, meets Arwen, and sends Frodo off with her. She rides west to the Bruinen River, where she summons water horses and washes away the Nazgul. And I actually have mini water horses printed on the map in a transparent resin designed to match the color of the water here, so the form of the horses is hard to see at this scale, especially on my cameras, which don't do the size of these landmarks justice, but they are there and you can kind of see them here. So it's somewhere around here that Gandalf escapes Orthanc on the back of a great eagle and is transported northwest to Rivendell, where he is reunited with the hobbits. And shortly thereafter, the Council of Elrond is held. Now, since we're looking at the Lord of the Rings through a lens of geography actually plays a huge role in how our favorite or not so favorite characters behave and act in this trilogy. Boromir, for instance, seems awfully tempted by the ring from the very first moment we meet him, and he comes across as a clear danger to the ring bearer and the entire quest. Like, he wants this thing for himself. But is Boromir actually the bad guy? Clearly, he's not. Now, here is something that you might not have considered until seeing this map. So we all know in the Fellowship of the Ring, Boromir, even at the Council of Elrond, seems awfully tempted by the power of the ring. We get these vibes and they last throughout the entire movie. And as kids watching this, we always felt like Boromir was weak, like he was flawed, like he gave in to the temptation of the ring's power. But he's the only member of the Fellowship who has real skin in the game from a history perspective. So the hobbits have spent their entire life right here in Hobbiton, and they've just barely learned the true nature of the ring's evil here at the Council of Elrond in Rivendell. Gandalf and Aragorn also understand the danger that it poses, but Aragorn has spent his entire life wandering the northern wilds of Middle-earth, and Gandalf has kind of been all over the place himself, and he doesn't really seem to stress too much about things. We know that he loves hanging out in the Shire because of his love for the halfling's leaf. But where does that leave Boromir? Mordor is over here, and the only thing that has kept Mordor's forces from just completely engulfing all of Middle-earth is Gondor. Gondor's forces have been at war with the growing power in Mordor, and Boromir himself and his men have paid for it with blood, sweat, their very lives. So when Boromir realizes that the Ring of Power might fall into his hands, he almost doesn't have a choice but to do everything that he can to try to obtain it. In fact, from his perspective, all of these free peoples of Middle-earth, free peoples, are free because of the blood that Gondor has been spilling, and he knows that Gondor can't keep things up much longer. The threat in the east is growing larger and stronger every day, and out of every member of the Fellowship, he is the only one who has seen battle in terms of actively engaging with Mordor's forces that are growing and preparing to attack Minas Tirith. Even Gimli, as a side note, actually comes from the Blue Mountains to the west of the Shire. Almost no member of the Fellowship, except for Boromir, has first-hand experience with the threat that is growing, which is why Boromir almost has no choice but to do everything he can to try to bring this great weapon, as Denethor calls it, back to Gondor. Which also makes sense why he doesn't get along with or respect Aragorn, because Aragorn, in his mind, should be fighting this battle with him. It also makes sense why Boromir has traveled farther than any other member of the Fellowship to arrive at the Council of Elrond. And for Boromir and Denethor and Faramir, they need this weapon in order to continue fighting a war that they're starting to lose. And this is context that you can miss even if you watch these films over and over and over, and it doesn't start to make sense until you pair these characters with the geography and where they are coming from. So Boromir, as a character and as a person, isn't nearly as flawed as we all might have thought when we were growing up. So if you're enjoying this video because you love The Lord of the Rings, consider grabbing yourself a Nightweave cloak. It's a small business that my wife and I started in early 2024, and we're growing pretty quickly because we had no idea, but there are nerds everywhere. We design everything right here in the United States, from cloaks to tunics to leather dusters, which is my personal favorite product that we carry. And if you head over there right now, you can use coupon code Christopher at checkout to claim what's yours and to save a little bit of cash. Now, back to the Fellowship. Anyway, so we have the Council of Elrond, and the Fellowship is formed. and they travel south to take the pass of Caradhras over the Misty Mountains. Now, this is not very well explained in the films, and it's part of one of the reasons I love the film so much is because there's so many layers of detail that you could just accept as part of the film, or if you dig deeper, you'll find like all these little Easter eggs. And one of those Easter eggs is the mountain of Caradhras was believed by the dwarves to be sentient, purposefully driving away and even killing travelers who tried to make the crossing at its pass. And here, where Gandalf and Saruman are working these spells around the storm that whips up over the Fellowship, in this scene, Saruman is actually saying, "Wake up, cruel red horn. May your horn be bloodstained." And Gandalf's reply is, "Sleep, Caradhras. Be still. Lie still. Hold your wrath." He's trying to lull the mountain back to sleep, but of course it's not enough. Frodo chooses to travel under the mountain. So the Fellowship travels back down the mountain and to the gates of Moria, where they travel under the Misty Mountains, and they lose Gandalf here at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. It's here on the other side of the Misty Mountains that they exit Moria, just northwest of Lothlorien. After traveling into the Golden Wood, Galadriel gives the Fellowship boats, which they then take down the Anduin River, past the Argonath, or the Pillars of the Kings, and it's here at Amon Hen that the breaking of the Fellowship happens. Boromir is killed by Lurtz on the west bank of Nen Hithilwa. Frodo and Sam travel east into Emun Muil. Merry and Pippin are taken captive by the Uruk-hai, who carry them west across the plains of Rohan, and Boromir's body is sent off the falls of Rauros. And Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli run after the Uruk-hai, and the Fellowship of the Ring ends. So the Two Towers starts off with Frodo and Sam, struggling to find their way through Emun Muil. And this is where they meet Gollum, who decides to help them, and the three of them work their way across the Dead Marshes towards the Black Gate of Mordor. Meanwhile, Merry and Pippin are being carried across the plains of Rohan, right here towards Isengard. Now, this is a small area on the map, but this distance between Amon Hen and the plains of Rohan and the borders of Fangorn Forest is actually around 130 miles, a distance that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli traverse in just 3 days before they meet Éomer.
Now in the books, Éomer marvels at the speed of the three hunters who run from Amon Hen across the plains of Rohan and catch up to the Uruk-hai on the borders of Fangorn Forest.
So the night before they meet Éomer, Merry and Pippin are led to the borders of Fangorn Forest right here, where they escape into the woods and meet Treebeard. Now back to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, who are running across the plains of Rohan. We get a sense of the epic nature of this chase in the films, but not really the distance. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli then find the carcasses on the edge of Fangorn Forest, and you might not know this, but in this scene, when Viggo Mortensen kicks this helmet, he actually breaks his. So next, the three hunters enter Fangorn Forest from the east, as Frodo and Sam approach the Black Gate of Mordor and are stopped by Gollum, who knows another way. Back in Fangorn, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are reunited with Gandalf the White. While this is happening, Frodo and Sam and Gollum leave the Black Gate, heading south along the west side of the Mountains of Shadow towards Minas Morgul. And back west, Gandalf the White and the three hunters travel southeast away from Fangorn towards Edoras. And it's here that Gandalf releases Theoden from his ties to Saruman, who has been building an army over at Isengard. And if you look at this, Isengard is super close to Edoras. We're talking probably 50 to 80 miles. And this is another detail and plot device that was sort of lost to me when I first watched these films, probably even the 100th time that I watched them. Edoras obviously relies on the riders of Rohan to defend it, but without Éomer and his riders, Edoras is completely defenseless. And Éomer doesn't know that Saruman's influence over Theoden has been broken. If the riders of Rohan were at Edoras, there'd be no need to go to Helm's Deep. But Helm's Deep is the only option for Theoden and his people, which is why Theoden makes the decision to go there so quickly. This snap decision is very much based on geography. You see, Helm's Deep is west of Edoras, right between Edoras and Isengard. Theoden knows that Saruman will likely move towards Helm's Deep first before sweeping east to take out Edoras. So if Theoden moves his people too late, Saruman's army could beat them to Helm's Deep and catch them out in the open. And without the riders of Rohan, it's game over. So Gandalf leaves Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli at Edoras as he takes off riding around the Rittermark looking for Theoden and his loyal riders, giving himself 3 days to accomplish the task, knowing how long it will take before Saruman's army arrives at Helm's Deep. So while the three hunters, Éowyn, Theoden, and the people of Edoras make their way across the rolling hills of the White Mountains, Frodo and Sam are probably somewhere between Caer Andros and Ithilien, and this is where they're captured by Faramir. He takes them here, to Henneth Anun, a hidden outpost behind a waterfall. And this is where they're stuck during the Battle of Helm's Deep. Now here are a couple of things worth pointing out about the Battle of Helm's Deep. During the battle here, Merry and Pippin are in Fangorn Forest helping to wake up the Ents and get them to go to war against Isengard. So remember, Isengard's army marches southeast to Helm's Deep where the battle happens. And overnight, the entire forest of Fangorn actually moves south towards Helm's Deep. Haldir's elves arrive before the battle begins from the north, and as all of that's happening, Faramir has moved Frodo and Sam out of Henneth Anun and south to Osgiliath, where they're almost caught by Nazgul, and this is where Sam gives his famous speech.
But there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
Meanwhile, Gandalf has found Éomer and the Riders of Rohan, and they move through the mountains to charge down this hill towards the Uruk-hai right at sunrise. And I saw a Reddit discussion one time about this. Why did Gandalf wait for dawn before attacking at Helm's Deep? Were he and Éomer just chilling behind this big bluff waiting for dawn to time their attack while lives below were being lost? And that's unlikely. Rohan as a kingdom is huge, and Gandalf probably rode all over the place gathering riders until the very last moment that he could return back to Helm's Deep in time for dawn to arrive. Not because there was anything special about the dawn, he just knew that it was unlikely that Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and whoever else they were fighting with would be able to hold off Saruman's army much longer than that. So we see a victory at Helm's Deep at this point. We see a cleansing of Isengard, where the Ents break the dam and flood the space, and far east as this movie comes to a close, Faramir lets Frodo, Sam, and Gollum go. They travel away from Osgiliath towards Minas Morgul, and this is where the Two Towers ends. Whew! Okay, so this is a pretty long video, and it's because this trilogy is long, and in my opinion, it's not long enough. It could have been 15 hours and I would have been happy about it. And also, I'm not too sad about it because I really want to savor this time that we have together exploring Middle-earth using this map as a visual. So, on to Return of the King. So, the film opens up with Smeagol's backstory, and all of these scenes showing the finding of the One Ring of Power actually occur right here, in the Gladen Fields, where Isildur lost the One Ring. This is east of the Misty Mountains, and after that backstory, we join Frodo, Sam, and Gollum at the crossroads of Ithilien, right here. And on my map, it's marked by a statue of a Gondorian king whose head was replaced with a carved eye of Sauron, just like in the film. These three make their way east towards Minas Morgul and the Winding Stair. Meanwhile, all the remaining Fellowship is reunited at Isengard, which is now flooded. And that's how my model depicts Isengard. So, after killing Wormtongue and Saruman and taking his Palantir, everyone heads back to Edoras to celebrate the victory at Helm's Deep. But Pippin picking up the Palantir forces the Fellowship to make their next move. They now know that they're running out of time, and they can't know for sure that Sauron didn't get information about Frodo and Sam. And not just that, but Sauron now knows that Isildur's heir has returned. So Gandalf takes Pippin to Minas Tirith to convince Denethor to call for aid from Rohan, because he knows that the growing forces in Mordor can't be held back by Gondor's armies alone. So Denethor isn't really interested. He just wants to eat tomatoes and send Faramir to what is a certain death on the borders of Osgiliath, which has been taken back by orcs. But Pippin and Gandalf light the beacons of Gondor anyway, and these beacons light across this mountain range and are seen by Aragorn at Edoras. From here, Edoras empties and the whole crew travels to Dunharrow, where the Rohirrim all gather. It's also here that Aragorn slips away with Legolas and Gimli under the Dimholt Road to call the armies of the dead to fulfill their oaths to the ancient kings of Gondor. Éowyn and Merry join the Rohirrim in secret and begin their journey to Gondor. And while all of that is happening, Mordor moves forces into Gondor from Minas Morgul. Frodo and Sam have snuck past this army and up the Winding Stair, and are now working their way to Shelob's lair, even though they don't realize it. Frodo, of course, right here is betrayed by Gollum. He's stabbed, Sam saves him and the ring, and Frodo is taken up to the Tower of Cirith Ungol, where Sam has to save him a second time. And honestly, Samwise is not the most exciting character, but is one of my favorite characters in all of cinema because of how loyal of a person he is to Frodo. So at this point, our timeline for the story sort of compresses. Merry, Éowyn, Éomer, and Theoden all arrive at the Pelennor Fields from the north and charge Mordor's forces during the siege of Minas Tirith. Around that same time, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli emerge from under the mountain with the army of the dead, and their first set of kills are the Corsair ships traveling up the river to Minas Tirith right here. And they take those ships and sail to the south of the city at a port where they approach with the army of the dead from the south. At that same time, Pippin and Gandalf are barricaded at the upper levels of the White City, and Theoden is killed on the Pelennor Fields with the Witch King who's slain by Éowyn, and all of the surviving main characters regroup after the Battle of Minas Tirith up here at the top in the throne room. And it's here that Aragorn proposes a final march on the Black Gate of Mordor to buy Frodo and Sam more time. And keep in mind, they have no idea where the two are. They don't even know if Frodo and Sam are alive. And this decision means the entire surviving fellowship, aside from Frodo and Sam, with the forces of Rohan and Gondor, march east to the Mountains of Shadow, where they turn north up through Aemon Muel to arrive at the Black Gate. And this is a huge trip that happens in just a few seconds in the movies. In fact, speaking of a longer film, we could have probably added another 15 to 20 minutes to The Return of the King showing this journey, having Aragorn come into his role as king, and we could have gotten to see more of Gimli and Legolas's romance bloom.
What's happening out there?
Shall I describe it to you? Or would you like me to find you a box?
Not to mention what's going on in Gondor between Faramir and Éowyn, because like I said, this trip likely took weeks, and Faramir and Éowyn actually have a pretty rich backstory after the Return of the King. So the Return of the King wraps up with the battle at the Black Gate. Frodo and Sam have made their way across the plains of Gorgoroth to Mount Doom, where the ring is destroyed. Gandalf comes in to pick them up and take them back to Minas Tirith immediately, and the rest of the Fellowship has to walk all the way back on foot. So finally, at Minas Tirith, we have Aragorn's coronation. A king bows to hobbits, and this is the last time the full Fellowship will ever be together in one place. The four hobbits travel back to the Shire with Gandalf. They likely pick up Lord Elrond and Galadriel and Bilbo along the way, and shortly after arriving back at the Shire, Elrond, Galadriel, Gandalf, Bilbo, and Frodo sail west into the Undying Lands. But this isn't where the story ends for our favorite characters. And it's not the end of this video. We have a little bit more to go to explain what happened to everyone after the events in Return of the King. And if you've enjoyed this video so far, like I said earlier, the best way to support the channel is by picking up a Nightweave cloak. But if you can't, or if you already have one, please check out the Nightweave YouTube channel, where we have some lore that we're starting to develop and fantasy-based long-form storytelling around characters that we're creating ourselves. Of course, it's no Lord of the Rings, but it is pretty cool and it's in its baby phase, and we would love for you to join us from the very beginning as we grow this like fandom and world, this lore that ties into the cloaks that we sell. So check it out. It's a lot of fun. Now back to the Lord of the Rings map. So what happens to these characters after the events of the Return of the King? While the hobbits and Gandalf depart Minas Tirith, Gimli and Legolas also part ways. Legolas returns to Mirkwood and tasks himself with rehabilitating Middle-earth's forests. Gimli travels west and becomes the first lord of the Glittering Caves. That's the cave system just behind Helm's Deep. He settles there with a group of dwarves, and he personally helps rebuild the gates of Minas Tirith with mithril and steel. Legolas makes many trips south back into Gondor to design Prince Faramir's garden at his home in Ithilien, where he and his bride Éowyn now live. You might say, Prince Faramir, I thought Aragorn was king. And that's true. But Aragorn's rule begins with a number of decrees, and one of the first things that he does is reinstates Faramir and his whole bloodline as the stewards of Gondor. Faramir gets a chance to show his true quality, and he does. He cleanses the Morgul Vale and the eastern borders of Mordor, and during this time, Aragorn also orders the Old Kingdom and ruins of Arnor to be rebuilt and reestablished. He turns Isengard over to the Ents. He forbids man from entering into the Shire, and he appoints Pippin as the warden of the Northern Kingdoms. And Aragorn makes a number of enemies during his early years as king. Allies to Sauron and marauding groups around the regions draw Aragorn into small battles and short wars, but he doesn't fight them alone, because the appendices of The Lord of the Rings say that wherever King Elessar went with war, King Éomer went with him, and beyond the Sea of Rhûn and on the far fields of the south, the thunder of the cavalry of the Mark was heard, and the white horse upon green flew upon many winds. Éomer builds Rohan up once again as Gondor's strongest ally. He rules Rohan honorably until he becomes old, and all of these characters that we have come to love so much grow old, just like our parents are growing old, just like we are. And I think that's what makes these films and stories so special. They mirror our experiences and give meaning to the pain and loss that we all have to experience in life. So back in the Shire, Sam marries Rosie. They have 13 children. Merry becomes the master of Buckland, and it's said that Éowyn of Ithilien and Éomer of Rohan sent many fine gifts to him over the years, because the events in The Lord of the Rings bind all of these lives together until the end of their days. Rosie lives to be 98 years old before she passes, and at that time, Sam finally makes his trip to Valinor, where he dies a year later. Éomer lives to be 93, and when he felt that he was not long for the world of Middle-earth, he called for Merry to visit him one last time. Merry does, but he takes Pippin with him, and the two travel to Edoras to bid farewell to King Éomer. 61 years after the events of the War of the Ring, Merry and Pippin never return to the Shire. Instead, they travel to Gondor to spend their final days with Arwen and Aragorn. The two hobbits pass not long after and are laid to rest somewhere in Gondor, but their final resting place will change. Éowyn and Faramir both grow old together and die in Ithilien. It's said that Aragorn and Arwen rule Gondor in glory and bliss for 122 years. They have several children, and Aragorn finally dies at the age of 210. He senses his time coming, and he offers comfort to Arwen before finally passing in the 120th year of the Fourth Age of Middle-earth. And we can assume that Aragorn's death brings the surviving members of this story together for one last time. Gimli and Legolas no doubt traveled back to Minas Tirith to bid farewell to their friend and Gondor's first truly great king in centuries. Aragorn is laid to rest in the House of the Kings, alongside Merry and Pippin, whose bodies are moved to rest beside King Elessar. Arwen, who is racked with grief, suffers the fate predicted by her father, Lord Elrond, years before. She wanders north to Lothlorien, where she dies of a broken heart in Ceren Amroth, where she and Aragorn met over 2 centuries before. It's at this time that Legolas and Gimli make their final parting from Minas Tirith. Legolas builds a boat to sail west to Valinor, and he invites Gimli to join him. Gimli accepts, making him the only known dwarf to sail into the Undying Lands. And their departure from Middle-earth marks the final chapter for all of the characters that we came to love in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So thank you so much for spending so much time with me in Middle-earth. And before we leave, I want to get just a tiny bit preachy about these stories, because they basically raised me, and I'm sure that they helped raise many of you who watched this video all the way through to the end. And I think that these stories are special because they are able to speak to so many of us from so many different backgrounds. These stories speak to conservatives just as they speak to progressives. They speak to atheists as much as they do to Christians and people of faith. And that's something special, because these stories bring us all together across our differences, and today that's something that almost never happens. It's becoming more rare, and I feel like the world is becoming more hateful, more dark, and more dangerous because of it. And I think that the thing I love the most about The Lord of the Rings is it reminds us that we don't all have to share the same opinions or be from the same places or come from the same backgrounds to get together and get along and do something great. We don't all have to agree with Boromir's view of the ring, and we don't all have to have the lazy, sort of laid-back view on life that the hobbits do. Every member of the Fellowship came from different backgrounds, and I'm sure they disagreed on many different things. But in these stories, they were able to set aside their differences for the greater good. And I think that this is the main lesson of these films and what makes them so beautiful. And if we're unable to take those lessons and bring them into the real world, what do these stories actually mean? I'm not here to tell you what they mean, just simply here to ask the questions so that you can think about it for yourself. So Be sure to subscribe for more. Next, I'm going to be exploring the grounds of Hogwarts through miniatures, and this is a preliminary model. The actual one that I'll be building is going to be about, I want to say 5 times this size. So we'll be digging into the Harry Potter universe next, and I'll see you back here in a week or two. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.